Working Cows Podcast, episode 47.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast. Today, a very paradigm-challenging episode for me. But hey, what's the use of having a podcast about giving producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices if your own paradigms aren't challenged from time to time? On the show, I've got Will Munger. I connected with Will on Twitter. He was in South America doing some interesting work there, and I just thought that I wanted to talk a little bit more about what that work was and what his future in the ranching industry holds. So, Will, thanks for joining me on the Working Cows Podcast.
It's good to be here, Clay.
I just have really enjoyed the opportunity that we've had to interact a little bit and kind of get to know each other a little bit. So what has your involvement in the recent past been in the ranching industry?
Well, I was lucky enough to work a small little roundup this fall with my buddies over at the XK Bar Ranch in Crawford, Colorado. Do a little roundup, and we actually got to deliver some of their first meat to an outfit called Farm Runners, which is kind of connecting people who are wanting grass-fed beef, kind of regenerative ag techniques, connecting them to ranchers who are doing that sort of works. But this summer, which is where we kind of connected, I was working in Bolivia on a watershed restoration project that works with farmers and ranchers to protect water. And that's definitely a big interest of mine, is how farmers and ranchers can kind of continue to protect water in a lot of different sort of ways.
Is there something about how we manage our animals that can change the impact that we have positively or negatively on water?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just this real kind of, a lot of thinking happening about that right now. And I've actually just got a lot from the guests on your show in terms of them talking about kind of the regenerative techniques that they're involved in. One of the cooler episodes that I thought that you did was an interview with a rancher in Mexico who is doing a lot of regenerative techniques on desert landscapes that have been really eroded over the years. And kind of in Bolivia, in the drier area where they're running cows, and also in Utah, where they're running cows in pretty dry areas, those sort of regenerative techniques I think are really interesting and kind of what I'm hoping to study and understand more.
And how is ranching in Bolivia different than it is in the States?
Well, the part I was in, which is the Valle Grande region, it's mountains and cactus and hardworking people. So in a lot of ways, it felt like Utah, where I'm from. It's a lot of small campesinos, not huge herds out there, although definitely in the eastern region, kind of where the Amazon is, there's a lot of huge outfits, some from Brazil, Argentina, international outfits that are kind of involved in kind of much more kind of impactful ranching. And so we saw a big scale and in terms of kind of the impact of practices and kind of the innovation that people were using too.
That's interesting. What part of Utah are you in?
I'm in northern Utah in Cache Valley right now.
And what is are you working day labor mostly then, as far as your involvement in the ranching industry? Are you on a operation?
I definitely have in the past. This fall, I just started a PhD program in climate adaptation science and regenerative agriculture at Utah State University, which is a land grant school up here in Logan, Utah.
And what kind of questions are you asking in this PhD program?
Well, really what I'm interested in is how farmers and ranchers can best adapt to climate change and then also help mitigate the impact of climate change. And there's a lot of research right now about the ability to sequester carbon in soil, the ability to kind of adapt regenerative practices on ranches. And it's a really interesting time to study that and think about that and kind of learn from the people that are kind of doing that and experimenting right now.
kind of questions are you asking in this process through your PhD study? How are you hoping to grow in this process?
Yeah, so really kind of I started working with ranchers around water issues in a couple different ways. In kind of the High Plains area, South Dakota and Nebraska, when I connected with some ranchers who were involved in the campaign against the Keystone XL pipeline, because they, in the Sandhills region, were worried about the impact of an oil spill on their water. And it was really inspiring to see ranchers not only defend their water, but create alliances with native peoples who lived right next door to defend their water. And that's kind of an ongoing thing. And here in Utah, I was involved in helping to map out an aquifer on a ranch that was threatened by a tar sands mine out here. And so you're thinking about how people involved in the food system are protecting their waters. It's definitely something I've been thinking about over the years. And what interested me in this Bolivia project was the use of these reciprocal watershed agreements that they're organizing, where downstream users like irrigation associations, municipal governments, water cooperatives put together funds to incentivize ranchers in the upstream to kind of do best practices when it comes to water protection, and helping to keep forests intact in water recharge zones, and kind of improve some grazing practices. So I was really interested in kind of how they were doing that down there, and that's kind of how I got involved in that research.
And do you see that as something that can be brought to the States?
That's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of things that are happening in the States right now around water protection and water restoration, and kind of ranchers leading those efforts. I'm really excited to go down to the Quivira Coalition conference this fall down in Albuquerque, because I've kind of read about them over the years, and it seems like the stuff that they're doing is really interesting. So, I'm definitely not an expert. I'm more of a student in this sort of thing. And so, we're all kind of learning that right now. And, I'm really grateful that people like you are kind of bringing these different voices together and learning from each other, because that's, I think, really needed right now. Is kind of that, how do we build that capacity to learn, capacity to change? I think those are really important questions.
You and I, when we connected over a video call last week, both kind of shared our fandom of the Down to Earth podcast. And one of my great regrets of being a podcaster is my lack of time to listen to other podcasts I want to listen to. I listen to a lot of podcasts that I should listen to, podcasts about podcasting, and I nerd out there, but I don't get as much time to listen to the podcasts that I want to listen to as I would like to. And Down to Earth from the Quivira Coalition is definitely right up there as far as podcasts that I think are really great and really useful resources, and featuring a lot of out-of-the-box thinkers. So,
yep.
I guess that's what are you hoping to gain from your experience at the Quivira Coalition conference?
Well, I was actually just listening to one of their podcasts while I was cleaning some horse stalls this morning, and the person they were talking with is involved in kind of a mapping application to help regenerative agricultural practices. And a lot of the folks that I'm working with in my PhD program are kind of come from a geography background, are really interesting in kind of using, whether it's GIS systems, all the really, up-to-date technology, whether it's like drones or heat mapping, and thinking about how we can understand the spatial land use patterns that are happening right now, and how we can kind of turn those in a more regenerative direction. So it's cool to hear people kind of work on that. I think I have a lot to learn from that.
You are working on this PhD program, and the PhD program is focused on mitigating the effects of climate change, correct?
Well, really what it's trying to do is bring people from different disciplines together to, think interdisciplinarily. It's a terrible term, but really think, if you have in the room, an agronomist, a civil engineer, an anthropologist, a biologist, you're going to learn from kind of different approaches to trying to crack these questions. And adapting to climate change is going to be a complex endeavor, and so we really kind of need to learn from each other. And so the program that I'm in kind of throws all those people together, and we kind of develop projects and then kind of learn from each other in the course of doing that. And so, it's really interesting, because I feel like a lot of young people right now are really interested in things like regenerative agriculture, and thinking about food systems, food justice, climate justice, and kind of how these things kind of come together. So it's definitely, there's a lot of momentum around these concepts right now.
Yeah, I was just having a conversation the other day between the services at church with she's 90 something, and then another guy who's probably in his 60s, and we were all remarking about how different the way we get our food today is than it was when both of them were growing up.
What were sort of the differences that they were noticing and talking about?
Local. Food was local. Back then. Food was grown. This lady who lived 50 miles from the town I'm in, which is Belfouche, and she said back then it was the event of the year if we made it to town 50 miles. To travel 50 miles for her to come to Belfouche was the event of the year. And back then Belfouche was, it had a thriving downtown, had a movie theater, had some of those things, and we've seen a lot of that dry up over the years. It's interesting with this concern for local is coming back, and we're seeing the downtown of Belfouche come back as well. But, for her, all the food they consumed was pretty much food that they grew themselves, and then they would can it, they would preserve it, they would keep it, in a way that they could have that food year round. And so, I think that we're seeing this younger generation, our generation, interested in these more local food kind of movements, and getting back to connection to their food and connection to the people who produce their food, and an interest in that. So I think that's a very, very timely topic.
Yeah, definitely. So in Western Colorado, where I was working this roundup with a buddy of mine, they have some of the highest concentrations of organic farming in Colorado. There's kind of that back to the land thing. And so you have the hippie farmers and then the redneck farmers. And one thing that's cool about that area, there's a lot of crossover, a lot of people learning from each other, figuring out, even though kind of have different ideas, kind of the synthesis of that is really interesting. I was reading a great book that maybe you've read and you'd like. It's called by David Montgomery, called Growing a Revolution. And one thing that I thought was really interesting, he's talking about conservation ag, that combination of not tilling or minimum tillage, as they talk about, cover crops, diverse rotation, that sort of thing. And the people that he's talking to, kind of the organic versus conventional divide is a lot. There's a lot more crossover than I think some people might realize in terms of what people on the ground in farms are actually doing. But what's amazing in all of this is whether he's talking to someone that's conventional, leaning towards regenerative, or organic, kind of learning from maybe some of the aspects of conventional, is kind of that desire to protect soil, desire to pass land on to different generations. And that desire is strong right now. And I think it's really important to kind of encourage that and, share where and what people are learning.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of kind of the realization of the way that things were done in the past has been a process of depleting the soil and depleting the soil life, and we're now that we're able to see what's going on in the soil on a microbial level, even though we don't understand all of it, we're seeing that there's a lot more going on underneath the soil than we ever realized, and that if we can keep that soil structure intact under the soil, there's way more benefits than we know. I know that there's more benefits to it than we know now.
Yeah.
That we're going to continue to discover more and more benefits to managing that. And it's interesting to me that it's a lot of these land grant universities that are kind of on the leading edge of that research and that understanding and pushing that information out. Maybe they weren't the first ones to discover it, but they're definitely helping to get the word out on some of those things.
Yeah.
Another interesting conversation that I had just yesterday was with a guy whose uncle, and this guy is 65 years old, and his uncle, so that would have made his uncle probably, now his uncle would be late 80s, early 90s, and how he was farming back in the day. And I'm sitting there just blown away. This guy was in the 60s. He was farming in a way that a lot of ways that we would endorse now, as far as minimal tillage, or tilling as little as possible, putting cows back out on the ground where the hay crop was harvested, feeding them that hay back on that ground so that they're returning that nutrient cycle and keeping that nutrient cycle going, and I just think it's really interesting that maybe some of what they were doing was pragmatic, but it was also very beneficial to the soil health, and some things that we would call cutting edge now are just what people were doing 50 years ago, and are things that I think we would benefit a lot from, like what you're talking about, the food supply, the way we eat now is totally different than the way we ate 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think it has a lot to do with this desire that we see in our generation to get back to a connection to where our food comes from, and how we are impacting the world around us, just with our buying habits, with our food choices and different things like that.
Well, I'm curious, in all the conversations that you're having with people around the country, what are kind of your senses of, what the barriers and kind of impediments to people kind of realizing that right now? What's kind of standing in the way?
I think that we're, I think I'm answering your question. If I'm not, we can try again, but I think we're seeing, and I don't think it's too late, but I think we're seeing that even these 60, 70-year-old ranchers are starting to understand that they've got to tell the story of that animal's life. They've got to be able to tell that story of that animal's life before the concerned consumer is going to be interested in purchasing that product, and that concerned consumer is that demographic of people that are concerned, that's on the rise. And so conversation I was having yesterday, again, 3 guys in their 60s, 1 guy in his 40s, and 2 of us in our 30s. And, they were both, all the guys in their 60s were remarking about the change in the demand structure in the market, and how we have to do something as producers to basically prove ourselves that we are doing what's in the best interest of the land, what's in the best interest of the cattle, to the best of our ability. And there's some things that there's room for improvement, but I think the barrier right now is connection to the people who are consuming the products we're producing and telling that story in a compelling way.
Oh yeah, I mean I think that's right up there. I think one emphasis that I'm hearing a lot from scientists that I'm working with here at the university. They're also kind of thinking a lot about how do you communicate well the science that you're doing so that people kind of are able to engage it. And thinking about something like climate adaptation. There's been a lot of disinformation and a lot of polarization around that, and I'm sure as particularly in agricultural communities, people get climate change, but the terms that they use to talk about it aren't going to be the same ones that are going to work, say, like on the coasts in the big cities. But people who depend on land and whose livelihoods come from it get that you have to protect the water and soil, and you have to have a stable climate to be able to grow food. And so figuring out how we can communicate these sort of things and kind of forge new alliances and think through new ideas is a really important thing right now.
That's the other thing I think, and you touched on it there, the other barrier that I see to just this relationship is the polarization in our country. Our country is completely, there just doesn't seem to be a middle ground. You've got to be on one side or the other, and you've got to lob grenades at the other side to prove to your side that you are legitimately an ally. And I think that's just such a damaging thing. And I think there are very, very few areas of life where there isn't some massive polarization, and I appreciate what you're talking about with the redneck farmers and the hippie farmers and the crossover that exists there. Is that a positive relationship as you see it, or potential for positive relationship, or is it adversarial?
Well, just give you a couple of examples of that. When I was working out in the Book Cliffs area, we were essentially trying to protect the water by preventing this tar sand strip mine from going in. And the people who'd ranched right down the canyon from the mine, had been there, 30 years or so, and were really concerned about their water. But let me tell you, organizing between conservative Utah ranchers and climate justice activists, that's a big gap to jump, something simple and compelling like water can connect people, because people get that, people, especially out here in the desert, people get that water is life. And, I think kind of the huge unity that we saw at a place like Standing Rock, really showed that sort of water is life commonality really can unite a very diverse and broad set of people, I think also, and I'm sure this living in South Dakota, people kind of assume, the middle of the U.S. is just this giant red blob, when in actually, it's actually pretty diverse, and there's some pretty interesting thinking that comes out. There's a great book that is coming out right now by Gary Nabhan called The Food from the Radical Center. And he, did all this work interviewing all these food producers who are doing amazing work at, restoring biodiversity of food, restoring their watershed, kind of strengthening local food infrastructure and capacity. And it's happening all around. And it's a really untold story, that sort of momentum and all this collaboration that is working. So I guess, definitely, I definitely feel the polarization and the divide, but I think also people are doing a lot of work to bridge that in really interesting and innovative ways.
Yeah. And I think that I can, in touching on polarization, that can just be just can be attributed maybe to the fact that I am also captive to the narrative that the media wants to portray. They're pushing a narrative that keeps people terrified, which I think is the only purpose of media in our culture today, is to keep people terrified of each other, to keep people terrified of whatever boogeyman it is they see hiding in the closet. When in actuality, I grew up essentially apolitical. There was a pretty healthy distrust of the political process in my background. And so, I think that's probably representative of a lot of the middle of the country. Is maybe they skew left or right, but there's quite a bit of distrust of the unholy alliance between big business and big government. Yeah. And they understand, they're there on a day-to-day basis, and what someone can harvest from the ground one time and move on is going to be something that they have to continue to deal with for generations. And so there's that connection there. Like you're saying, water is life, and people are understanding that they need to be protecting these resources and these assets, or there could be long-term consequences. Yeah.
And, also protecting the people that work them, that actually produce those for people. From, the farm to the factory to the fork, all along that food chain. I think it's really important that we're telling stories about the people who do that work. Because, so few people in the population work in agriculture and understand what it means to grow and produce food. And I think that, when you really kind of look into who is doing that work, it might, surprise you who that is and the conditions that they're living through right now. Just to give you an example, in Cache Valley, where I live, there's a big meatpacking plant here. And way back in the Bush administration, there was this massive ice right there. And it really hurt and disrupted the community. And, we're seeing ice rates, increasing now at meatpacking plants all over, and so in some ways that was kind of a warning of what was to come. But, thinking about, how do we treat immigrant labor who are working within the food system, not only on ranches and farms, but, in processing and also in service work, that sort of organizing between all those different connections is really important right now. And I see groups trying to do that right now. National, the Food Chain Workers Alliance, HEAL, there's definitely some interesting work out there, but I think it's important that we tell those stories of the people, whose hands bring us the food we eat. Because I think a lot of people don't understand what it's like to do that. And so, podcasting and, kind of media directly between communities is so important, because that's where we can really tell that story without our corporate overlords, which is, I think, a good thing.
Yeah. That's I was in another discussion the other day, or actually a networking event, and this meat packer from Iowa made to me, it was, at the time, it was like, ooh, this is getting more political than I expected. He said, we've got to find a path to citizenship, and we need to find it quickly, because it is a threat to our ability to produce local beef if we can't continue to employ these people who are immigrant workers who are coming and willing to do the work and really, really good at the work.
And really good at the work, yeah.
But we can't find other people who are willing to do that work, and we can't find other people who are as good at that work as these people are. And, so I was kind of surprised. He was there to give us reasons to sell our calves to him, and he took probably 10 minutes in the middle of a 2-hour presentation and said, we need to find a path to citizenship, and we need to find it quickly, which was surprising to me. But, it goes right along with what you're saying. So, yeah. What we talked about the questions that you're going to be asking in your PhD work. What do you anticipate as some answers that you might get?
Well, I'm definitely not the first person to ask these sort of questions. And I think that, there's people all around doing this sort of work. But one thing that I think is very interesting right now is we're living in this period where kind of the people who have thought about this before, I'm thinking about here people like Wes Jackson and the Land Institute, or Holistic Management or Quivira Coalition, and all these groups that are kind of trying to support a transformative change in agriculture, in ranching. They're kind of into their next generation in the sense that they were doing this 30, 40 years ago, even more, and people like me who are kind of growing up and kind of coming into our own amidst the things that they're bringing to us, whether that's Kernza or whether that's kind of more precise regenerative ag and grazing techniques. And so I think the question right now, also because, we're the millennial generation, right? So we don't have access to capital. We don't have access to land. There's this huge question of how the next generation of farming actually gets into it, and groups like the National Young Farmers Coalition are, really trying to push that and think about that. How do you support the next generation of farmers and ranchers getting into it, and getting into it with the smartest, best available knowledge, technology, workforce, that sort of thing. And so we really need to be thinking about our food system, not only how we can bring justice to it, but how we can prepare for climate change and prepare for the shifts that might come with that. So there's some real challenges on the table, but luckily there's a lot of really amazing and brilliant people working on this right now.
Yeah, that transition piece is a big one. We got to be able to transition these ranches, especially, we got to be able to transition ranches to the next generation. We've got to be able to transition management, good management, especially to the next generation, so that we can continue to have positive impact on the ground, on the water, on the air, all those things, and if we can't figure out a way to transition it, then it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to continue to gain ground in the positive impacts that we're having on our resources. What else is keeping you busy? Anything else keeping you busy? A PhD student and a Mustang mare that you're working with?
So I just adopted this Mustang from the BLM's Wild Horse Program. And so it's been really fun to train him and kind of get things up and running. He's about a week into my life, so we're just getting started. But that's what I get up at dawn to do. So that keeps me busy.
Yeah, very much. And how can people connect with you if they want to keep up with your journey?
Follow on social media or come by. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much I have to contribute yet right now, but definitely stay in the conversation.
Well, no, I think it's a very, very interesting perspective. That's one thing I've really appreciated about the opportunity I've had through the Working Cows podcast, is just an opportunity to talk to people who think differently than me, and who, I'm still learning, that it's okay not to be in, as one podcast that I listen to, it's okay not to be on the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. So getting outside of my box and getting outside of my typical sphere of influences has been really good. So I would encourage people to follow you at Will Munger on Twitter, if that's all right, and connect with you there. So Appreciate your time today, Will.
Yeah, I appreciate you. I think some of the best learning is, going to happen at the margins, and it's going to happen, where, different things rub up against each other. So, I appreciate you really trying to widen the circle and, keep doing what you're doing. Appreciate it.
Will do. Thank you. Thanks for your time. Coming up next week on the show, we've got Troy Hadrick joining us, and we're going to talk about GeneMax testing. So if you've got any questions about GeneMax testing, I'm just saying, you could go over to workingcows.net/support, gain access to patreon.com/workingcows, and from there, join as a patron of the show. For as little as $1 a month, gain access to the private Facebook group where you can ask questions of all of our future guests, except, of course, that special guest number 50 on the Working Cows podcast. But you could ask any questions you've got about GeneMax testing, and I will work it into the show with next week's guest for episode 48 of the Working Cows podcast, Troy Hadrick.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.